Welcome to another episode of Summa Made Simple. We are continuing our exploration of the topic of fortitude. And last time in the previous episode, we discussed fear. And after the articles on fear, come some articles on fearlessness and daring. I read those articles and I thought to myself, how would this apply to the man on the street? Why should he care about these points? I could not find an answer to that question. So I jumped forward now to the part of fortitude. That's the next part after daring and fearlessness. And when I stopped there, I was like, okay, now this, I think I see why this should be of interest to the ordinary guy on the street. And the reason why the parts of fortitude, so every time Aquinas speaks about the parts of a virtue, what he's going to do is going to break it down into the various sub-virtues or sub-habits that belong to it. And the reason why that's important is it shows you, or it illustrates to us, the many faces of that virtue, the different shapes and forms in which that it can take, how it's applied in different ways in our lives, how it shows up in different occasions. And that's important to understand so that one is always prepared or ready to respond to different circumstances in the right way. Think of it as someone who's going to climb up a really high mountain, right? And maybe it's Everest. Like if you're going to climb Everest, you want to make sure that you've got all the equipment that you need. You don't want to get to a stage where you're like, oh gosh, seems I left my ice pick behind. Or, oh gosh, seems I left my oxygen tanks behind. No, you want to know that, okay, at this altitude, or if this happens, we're going to need ice picks. So you better have them. At this altitude or this whatever, we're going to need oxygen. So you better have them. And that's similar with all these parts of virtues, so that you know in this situation, in this circumstance, in this occurrence, this is the shape that this virtue takes, or this is the shape that this virtue has or looks like. And when it comes to the parts of fortitude specifically, let's get into the point. We're reading question 128 of the parts of fortitude. And the first article, which is the one we're tackling in this episode, asks whether the parts of fortitude are suitably assigned. In this section where he speaks about the different parts of the virtue, he introduces, well, he doesn't introduce it here. The first time he speaks about it is when he speaks about prudence, which is handled in an earlier question in the Summa. But then, we started with fortitude. I sort of just jumped into like fortitude. Then I guess maybe I'll work backwards into prudence or justice. Anyway, we'll see how things go. Main thing is he introduces terminology here, which is really important terminology to understand. The thing about Aquinas is he uses some terms, some technical terms here and there. Most of the time he doesn't, but he from time to time uses technical terms, which if you just understand them once, it makes a lot of what he says clear. So it's really important that we understand these terms now. Every time he'll speak about the big virtues, call them the cardinal virtues, fortitude, temperance, justice, prudence, he'll always speak about the parts of that virtue. And then this is where he uses some technical terminology, which is important to understand. The technical terms he uses are the integral parts of a virtue, the quasi-integral parts of a virtue, the potential parts of a virtue, and the subjective parts of a virtue. So these are terms which he'll repeat over and over and over when he's speaking about the different parts of different virtues. So it's important that we sort of understand them right now at the beginning, because it's going to be repeated later on. The best way to understand these terms, integral, quasi-integral, potential and subjective parts of a virtue, is to think of it using an analogy. Let's say you have a house. Let's use a house as an analogy. And you've got two different houses. Let's say house number one is a castle. It's a medieval castle in the middle of, Scotland in the Middle Ages, right? And then the other house is a modern day contemporary house in the suburbs, in a really rich suburb somewhere of some big city somewhere in the world, right? So those are two houses. Now, at the very core, essential part of it, like they do both serve the same purpose, maybe for different people, but both of them are houses. They both provide shelter. What do they have in common at the integral part? So the integral part of a house is the walls, the foundation, the roof. Without these things there, you cannot call that structure a house. In a similar way, every virtue or every cardinal virtue, every large grouping of virtues has specific essential things without which you cannot call that virtue that specific virtue. So these are called the integral parts of a virtue. When you look at a house, whether that house is a castle or whether it's a suburban townhouse, whatever it is, when you look at a house, now there are other things which are not like absolutely essential to the core of that house, but they are kind of just next to the essential. They're almost essential. And those are the things which are called, you could call them the quasi-integral parts of a house. So for instance, if you're looking at a castle, I would say the quasi-essential parts of a castle would be maybe a hearth or a fireplace, a stairwell that takes you from the ground floor to the top of the highest tower. If you're looking at a suburban house, you'd be thinking of things like the electricity wiring, the plumbing, the central heating. So these are things which are not absolutely 100% essential for you to call that structure a house, but they're almost essential for the house to be the house that it's supposed to be. So these are the quasi-integral parts. Similarly with virtues, you have things which are not 100% essential for that virtue to be that virtue, but they're almost essential. These are the quasi-integral parts of a virtue. Then you have the potential parts. If you go back to the house analogy, the potential parts of a house, so remember we've said the integral parts of a house are the walls, the foundation, the roof. Quasi-integral parts of a house could be a stairwell, could be a hearth or a fireplace, electricity, plumbing. If you look at going to the idea of the potential parts of a house, these are think of them as extensions, things which you add to the house, which make it perform specific functions better. They are not absolutely essential to the functioning of the house, but they make the house perform specific functions better. So for instance, in a suburban house, this could be a home theater or a pool, a swimming pool with a nice pool deck, or a porch or a veranda. If you look at a castle, maybe that could be a moat around the castle, a drawbridge and a portcullis. These are things which are not absolutely essential. They're not even next to essential, but they may be there or they may not be there. But when they are there, they kind of they give that house, the castle or the suburban house, more tricks up its sleeve, more things that it can do. Applying this to virtues, the potential parts of a virtue are things which are virtues or habits which, when they are there, they enable the person to do more things that are aligned or that are in keeping with that virtue. They kind of like give him, it's like bonus skills that he or she is able to do or to carry out. And then you've got the subjective parts of a virtue. Let's go back to the house. If you were to look at two houses, the castle and the suburban house, the subjective parts of a house will be those things that have to do with very specific tastes that, one owner, so they relate to people now. Like one owner wants his castle to be used as a museum, and the other owner wants his castle to be used as a fortress just for him and his family. Another owner would say, I want this castle to be used as a fortress, but for the whole town. Like if we're being invaded by someone, raise the gates, the town comes in, close the gates, everyone's safe, and you can have a siege, and it'll be cool for 6 months type of situation. And that's actually whether that would influence the design of that castle. Similarly with a house, when you look at what subjective parts of a house, it can be, how is this house furnished? Is it furnished so that it can be a home for me and my family, or is it furnished so that it can be an Airbnb or a holiday home? And if it's a home for me and my family, is it how big is my family? Is it just one kid? Is it 3 kids? Is it 10 kids? Like how big is it going to be? So those are now the subjective. Applying that to a virtue, to virtues, the subjective parts of the virtue have to do with different people in different circumstances, and how that virtue takes shape or how it looks in very specific circumstances, especially when it comes to dealing or interacting with other people. So those are the subjective parts of a virtue. With that in mind, we can now tackle the point. Aquinas says, where now he breaks up fortitude into its integral, quasi-integral, potential, and subjective parts. I answer that, as stated above in a previous question, a virtue can have three kinds of parts: subjective, integral, and potential. But fortitude, taken as a special virtue, cannot have subjective parts, since it is not divided into several specifically distinct virtues, for it is about a very special matter. In other words, he's saying fortitude is so specific, it has such a set function, that you actually cannot say that fortitude for this person is going to be different than fortitude for that person, depending on their use case, etc. It's just saying across the board, fortitude does not have subjective parts because it is so specific. As opposed to say something like justice, which we shall look at later. Justice does have subjective parts in terms of the interactions between people. But that's a story for another day. Hopefully we'll get there. Carrying on with the point. However, there are quasi-integral and potential parts assigned to fortitude. Integral parts, with regard to those things, the concurrence of which, meaning if they coincide at the same time, it is required for an act of fortitude. In other words, these things have to be there for the act to be called an act of fortitude or resilience. And potential parts, because what fortitude practices in face of the greatest hardships, namely dangers of death, certain other virtues practice in the matter of certain minor hardships, and these virtues are annexed to fortitude as secondary virtues to the principal virtues. So what is he saying in summary? What he's saying in summary is that fortitude has no subjective parts. Fortitude has integral and quasi-integral parts. These are things which, if they're not there, like, don't call it fortitude, don't call it resilience if these things are not there. And then, over and above the resilience, there are certain parts which need to be practiced when facing minor hardships. Why? Because fortitude concerns itself with the major difficulty of death, primarily. Like being prepared to die so as to do what's good. We spoke about that in a previous episode. But then you've got other situations where it's difficult, but the difficulty is not death. You're not facing, the stakes are not life and death. It's something difficult, but the stakes are not life and death. Now, you could call these now the little cousins or little brothers of fortitude. And these are the potential parts of fortitude. That's what Aquinas means when he's speaking, when he says there certain other virtues practice in the matter of certain minor hardships, and these virtues are annexed to fortitude as secondary virtues to the principal virtue. So every time in this point when he says annexed as secondary virtues to the principal virtues, he means the potential parts of that virtue, additional skills, leveling up, as it were. As stated above, the act of fortitude is twofold: aggression and endurance. So basically saying these are the integral parts of fortitude: aggression and endurance. And as we had mentioned in a previous point, previous episode, endurance is more proper to fortitude than aggression. Moving on. Now, two things are required for the act of aggression. The first regards preparation of the mind, and it consists in having a mind ready for aggression. Just a minor sidebar about that phrase. Preparation of the mind consists in having a mind ready. This concept of having the mind ready to do something is what it means when we say that a virtue is a habitual disposition, a habitual readiness, a habitual preparedness to do something that is good, depending on the situation, what the good is in that situation. A very good example of this, to understand that virtue has to do with preparedness of the mind. If you remember in Scripture, when Jesus Christ was speaking to his disciples at some stage, he told them, if someone slaps you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. Remember Jesus said that. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. Fast forward to his trial before the high priests. And then the high priest asked him, hey, so what is it that you've been teaching? And then Jesus, he quotes, he just, it's like, basically he points out how ridiculous that question is, because it's almost as though, you're arrested and you're taken to court on trial. I mean, it's not for you to condemn yourself. The prosecutor has to bring up witnesses and say, yeah, we saw this guy doing this wrong thing. So Jesus is basically pointing that out. He's like saying, hey, Why are you asking me what I've been saying? You have all these people around who I've never hidden what I've said. You've got witnesses. Ask them what I said. And then someone slaps him. And Jesus does not turn the other cheek. In fact, he says, hey, if what I've said is wrong, point out the wrongdoing. Otherwise, why are you slapping me? Is this a contradiction? Didn't he earlier say, if someone slaps you, turn the other cheek? Fast forward a year or 2 years, I don't know the exact timeline. Later, someone slaps him on the cheek and he doesn't turn the other cheek. He says, wait, why are you doing this? Is that a contradiction? No, it is not. Because when Jesus earlier was speaking about turn the other cheek, he was speaking about virtue. He was speaking about a virtue, the virtue of fortitude, of endurance. In that specific, it was saying you have to be prepared in your mind you have to be prepared to endure all of these things that can happen to you. But that does not mean that you actually do that particular action, because later on, he now had to balance that virtue of fortitude with the demands of justice, because the laws were being broken, laws were being flouted. So in that situation, like between these two, you do something that's fortitude, that's based on fortitude, or do you do something that's based on justice? And that's the beautiful thing about the virtues. Virtues are not they're not rules that are meant to tie our hands and imprison us. No, they're rules which in a sense give us the freedom to use our mind in every situation to judge what is the correct thing to do. Moving on. So the first regards preparation of the mind. Okay, now two things are required for the act of aggression. So he's speaking about the things which are needed for the integral part of this house called fortitude. Now, two things are required for the act of aggression. The first regards preparation of the mind and consists in having a mind ready for aggression. In this respect, Tully mentions confidence, of which he says that with this, the mind is much assured and firmly hopeful in great and honorable undertakings. Who's Tully? Tully is Cicero. Cicero was a Roman statesman and philosopher who was really a great thinker and orator and rhetorician. And it's one of the people who makes me wish I could read and understand Latin, because sometimes I feel the translations of his speeches just don't do him justice. The second regards the accomplishment of the deed and consists in not failing to accomplish what one has confidently begun. In this respect, Tully, Cicero, mentions magnificence, which he describes as being the discussion and administration, in other words, accomplishment of great and lofty undertakings with a certain broad and noble purpose of mind, so as to combine execution with greatness of purpose. What does this mean? In simple terms, what he is saying is the integral parts of the house and the roof of fortitude. The roof and the foundation of fortitude are endurance and aggression. Now, if you want to level up aggression, when you think of aggression itself, moving forward to face something that's difficult, there are two things. Number one is you have to have a mind that's ready to react and to move forward, a mind that's prepared to fight. And that is what he's calling confidence. That is what he's calling, quoting Cicero, mentions confidence. Then at the same time, so that gets you going. Then at the same time, you need another thing that keeps you going in terms of that aggressive act of moving forward to face that danger and tackle it. And then he says that thing you've got the thing that will get you going, that's called confidence. And then you've got the thing that will keep you going, and that is called magnificence. Tully mentions magnificence, which he describes as being the accomplishment of great and lofty undertakings with a certain broad and noble purpose of mind, so as to combine execution with greatness of purpose. Accordingly, if these two be confined to the proper matter of fortitude, namely to dangers of death, they will be quasi-integral parts thereof, because without them there can be no fortitude. Whereas if they are referred to other matters involving less hardship, there will be virtues specifically distinct from fortitude, but annexed thereto as secondary virtues to principle. In other words, there will be potential parts. Thus, magnificence is referred to by the philosopher to great philosopher. Remember, we said philosopher means Aristotle. Thus, magnificence is referred to by the philosopher Aristotle to great expenses. In other words, you undertake something that's difficult, and then you realize, this thing is going to take a lot of money and effort. And he says that virtue is called magnificence. Aristotle calls magnificence. And magnanimity, which seems to be the same as confidence to achieve great honors. When you say, this is a difficult thing, but it's fantastic, it's great, let me go for it. That's preparedness of mind to rush into something to move forward into something that's difficult. What Cicero called confidence, Aristotle calls magnanimity. Again, two things are requisite for the other act of fortitude, namely endurance. Remember we said the roof, the foundation of fortitude, the walls are two, endurance and aggression. We've spoken about the two things which are needed for aggression, and those are magnanimity and magnificence. Now, when you look at endurance, the other part of it, what's needed for endurance? The first is that the mind be not broken by sorrow, by sadness, and fall away from its greatness by reason of the stress of threatening evil. In other words, many times when one has to endure something that's difficult, you can become sad. You can just become overwhelmed by sorrow and think, man, it's not worth it. Why am I doing this? Let me just give up. There's that kind of sadness. And to overcome that, to endure that, the first is that the mind be not broken by sorrow and fall away from its greatness by reason of the stress of threatening evil. In this respect, he mentions patience, which he describes as the voluntary and prolonged endurance of arduous and difficult things for the sake of virtue or profit. The other is that by the prolonged suffering of hardships, man be not wearied so as to lose courage. According to Hebrews 12 verse 3, that you be not wearied, fainting in your minds. In this respect, he mentions perseverance, which accordingly he describes as a fixed and continued persistence in a well-considered purpose. Let's try and break this down and understand it. What he's saying is, for endurance, for a person to be able to endure, he needs two virtues. He needs two other virtues. When you're enduring something difficult, there are two kinds of reactions that one can have. Number one is sadness. This is not worth it. This is such a waste of time. Why am I doing this? Things will never change. Things will never get better. Let me just give up type of situation. Now, to endure that, what you need is the virtue of patience. Then on the other hand, in the face of these difficulties which one has to endure, one can just get exhausted. Like you're mentally, you're spiritually exhausted. So it's not that you're sad, it's that you're tired. You're not sad, you're just tired. You're like, oh, this has been going on for way too long. I don't see the finish line. I am so tired. I need a break. Heck, let me just give up, actually. And for that, to endure things which are tiring and not give in to the exhaustion, what you need is perseverance, which accordingly he describes as a fixed and continued persistence in a well-considered purpose. If these two be confined to the proper matter of fortitude, meaning if those two are just considered with respect to endurance and aggression, they will be quasi-integral parts thereof. But if they be referred to any kind of hardship, they will be virtues distinct from fortitude, yet annexed thereto as secondary to principle. In other words, if they are not considered with respect specifically to endurance and aggression, but are taken more as separate things that have to do with smaller, minor hardships, not big things, then you can speak of them as specifically potential parts of that virtue. So in other words, what he's saying is that magnanimity, magnificence, patience, perseverance can either be almost integral parts of fortitude, or depending on your point of view, they can also be potential parts of fortitude. The distinction is a minor one, it's a subtle one, perhaps it doesn't matter to the man on the street, but it's an important one to be aware of, because it's going to come later on as we speak of each of these virtues one by one. So those are the 6 phases of resilience or fortitude. What's the practical takeaway? Constant vigilance, like look out in your life and identify, hey, this area calls for the name of the virtue of the shape that fortitude takes in this particular aspect is patience, and that one is perseverance, and they're not the same thing. And this one requires magnificence, and that one requires magnanimity, and they're not the same thing. I think it was Mad-Eye Moody in Harry Potter who used to like to say constant vigilance. So that's the practical takeaway from this episode. Going forward is constant vigilance, as Mad-Eye Moody said, for these different phases of how resilience shows up, or the need for it shows up in our day-to-day lives.